y'all, Dixie here. Today I want to talk to you about backpacking in inclement weather, including rain, wind, hail, and lightning. Obviously, the best thing to do is to avoid the trail in inclement weather. It's not fun hiking in the rain or being caught in a lightning storm, but you can't always tell what the weather is going to do. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're in some bad weather, hopefully some of the tips in this video will help. It's always recommended that before going out on trail, you check the forecast, not only for what the weather is going to do in terms of rain, but also for the temperature. And if you're going to be backpacking at higher elevations, keep in mind that if you check the temperature for a town nearby the trailhead that you're planning to start at, the temperature may register at a town that is much lower in elevation than the actual trail you'll be hiking. You need to prepare for what the temperatures are going to be at the actual elevation that you'll be hiking, not at the nearest town. Before you hit the trail, you should make sure that you have redundancies in your waterproofing. After backpacking with a pack that's made out of Dyneema, I really can't recommend it highly enough, especially if you're going to be in rainy conditions. Other packs that aren't made out of waterproof material tend to hold more moisture in the material, so your pack weight increases every time it rains. Also, because Dyneema is for the most part waterproof, you're adding another redundancy in your waterproofing of your gear. If you already have a pack, or even if you're going to go with a Dyneema pack, you should line it with some sort of pack liner. A cheap option that's fairly lightweight is a compactor bag. I usually just put the compactor bag down in my pack and then put any of the gear that I don't want getting wet, even if I've already waterproofed it somehow, because again, redundancy is good. In the compactor bag inside of my pack, I'll put my sleeping bag, my clothes, electronics, or anything else that I don't want getting rained on. And most of those items I either have in a waterproof sack or Ziploc baggies. Once I have everything in that I don't want getting wet, then I roll down that compactor bag, and on top of that, I put any of the gear that I'm not concerned about getting wet. So my tent, my food bag, and my cooking pot. Then I roll down the top of my pack and I'm good to go. They do make pack covers for packs to kind of help with the rain. If you have a Dyneema pack, I wouldn't really worry about fooling with a pack cover. If you don't, you can use one. I did find on the Appalachian Trail that they helped repel some water from my pack, but I would not rely on this as your only form of waterproofing your pack and your gear. Not only should you protect your gear from the rain, but also yourself, so you need rain gear. Some people will use ponchos to have yet another redundancy for their gear because the poncho will cover them and their pack. I prefer to just have the rain jacket and rain pants. That way I can also use it against the wind on windy days. And I like having raincoats that have pit zips because they help regulate the temperature. And then the rain pants, I like when I can adjust the size of the ankle either with a zipper or if it's an elastic band. Just anything that I can slide over my shoes so I don't have to worry about taking my hiking shoes off before I put on my rain pants. Some people backpack year-round with an umbrella. I found that I really like having it when I'm gonna be backpacking in cold rain. However, if you do have an umbrella while you're backpacking year-round, then it's pretty nice to be able to take some breaks on rainy days because you don't have to wait until you find a shelter or some cover from trees. You can just decide, I'm gonna take a break right here and now, and the umbrella really helps you to do that. For more detailed information about rain gear and or base layers, especially if you're gonna be hiking in cooler rain, then you can check out my backpacking clothing video, and I'll put a link to that in the video description. Just a tip on taking breaks and eating food on a rainy day. If most of the food in your pack is cooked food, it could put you in a bind on a rainy day because you're just gonna have to take cover and do the best you can when you can. But if you take more snacks and non-cooked foods when you're expecting rain, it'll be a little bit quicker. When you get a break real quick, you can just grab something and go. Say you've been backpacking in the rain all day and you've had enough of it and you're ready to stop. What is the best way to set up in the rain? I prefer to try to wait until there's kind of a break in it or a lull in it, at least it's not pouring down. But if you get to a certain point and you're tired, the show must go on and you're just gonna have to find a spot and stop. I like to find an area that's got some kind of tree cover because the leaves really help to keep the rain at bay. You want to look out though for any kind of widowmakers, that's what you call a dead limb that can fall and knock you in the head and kill you, or any other branch that looks like if things were to get windy or a storm was to get more intense that it could fall onto your shelter, because that's obviously not something that you want to happen. I also try to look out for any kind of dip in the ground because I don't want water to pool up under where I'm setting up my tent. If you're in an exposed area and it's windy and rainy and it just doesn't really look like you're gonna get any kind of big cover soon, then try to find some sort of windbreak like a bush. You could even look for a lower spot or a break in the terrain that will offer some kind of windbreak. But make sure you're not setting up in a gully of any kind where if it rains a lot, you're gonna end up getting washed away. There really is no magical way to set up your tent without getting rained on. You just have to be as quick about it as you can. With more practice, you'll get faster and faster. I think single wall tents do work a little bit better for this because they don't have a separate rain fly, so you're not putting up a mesh body that's getting rained in now while you're trying to put on the fly. The single wall tents just go up in one piece and are kind of blocking the floor of the tent while you're putting it up. When you're setting up your tent, make sure that your ground cloth or ground sheet isn't hanging way outside of your tent, and make sure it is tucked under your tent, because if it's sticking out a little bit, then that rain's going to run on top of it and you'll find yourself in a pool of water because there's going to be water collecting between the ground cloth and the bottom of your tent. Once your tent is set up, get the rest of your gear in it as soon as possible. And I try to be mindful that I haven't strewn my stuff all about while frantically trying to set up my tent. I try to keep it all kind of gathered in the pack. That way, once the tent goes up, the pack goes right inside and hopefully nothing's gotten wet. Once I'm inside my tent, before I pull out my clothing that I want to stay dry and my sleeping bag, I take my bandana and try to wipe all the moisture I can off the floor. Then I change out of my wet, gross clothes, toss them over in the corner, and get out everything that's dry. If you've transitioned to a shorter sleeping pad like I have and you're used to sleeping with your legs on your pack, it can be problematic when you have a soaked pack. So what I do is I'll either have a cheap, very, very lightweight poncho, those little 99-cent disposable ones, or even one of those space blankets. And that way I can unfold it and lay it out on top of my pack. And that allows me to use the pack under my legs while also keeping my sleeping bag dry. Be careful that you don't rest against the wall of your tent while you're sleeping on a rainy night. Condensation can be an issue, and then your bag can get pretty damp. And if this happens for several rainy nights in a row, then you might be pretty chilly at night. Double wall tents are better for condensation in that they help prevent condensation because the tent is usually more ventilated because you have the mesh wall and then the second wall or the rain fly, which typically collects the condensation and allows it to run to the ground. Before I go to bed, I make sure that the tent is still taut. That way the rain will roll off the tent. When I set up my tent on a windy night, whether it's rainy or not, I stack rocks on the stakes to help keep them anchored in the ground, because I think one of the most annoying things in the middle of the night, especially if it's rainy, is having wind hit your tent and snatch a stake out to where half of your tent is collapsing on you while you're trying to sleep. So if you just take that precaution of stacking rocks on the stakes, you're probably going to be fine. As far as dealing with your wet clothes in your tent, I tend to just spread my stuff out beside me when I'm sleeping. If you have little loops in your tent, you could always fashion a clothesline. I'd make sure to wring everything out as well as you can though, that way you don't wake up with your clothes dripping on you. The truth is, if it rains all night long, your stuff probably isn't gonna dry anyway because of the dampness in the air. I've heard some people recommend that you can throw your wet socks or wet clothes into the bottom of your sleeping bag while you sleep at night, and then they'll magically be dry from your body heat in the morning. And I don't believe this. I have done this with socks before and they're still gross and damp in the morning, and now the toe box of my sleeping bag is wet. I just don't think it's a good idea to ever put anything wet directly in your sleeping bag. Maybe if you have something that's mildly damp, that could work. The morning after a rainy day is usually not fun. It probably involves screaming and crying like a little baby while I have to put on wet clothes. But I always put on my wet clothes. I don't wear the clothes that I designate to sleep in, especially if I'm gonna have cooler temperatures at night, because if it's raining the next day and those get wet, then the second night, what are you gonna sleep in? Because now your sleeping clothes are wet and cold and your hiking clothes are wet and cold. So I always reserve my sleeping clothes for sleeping unless it's a day that I'm gonna go into town. Sometimes all I need is a morale booster though. So if I tell myself, you're putting on these wet clothes, you're gonna be a good girl and do this, but you get to have dry socks. Now I don't use the socks that are designated for sleeping, but I'll take 2 or 3 pair if I'm gonna be hiking in cold rain, and I'll allow myself to put on a pair of dry socks. Even if it's raining, I know that they're just gonna get wet in my wet shoes, but something about putting on a warm, dry pair of socks will go ahead and get me up out of my tent. So you might find that that tip works for you also. When I pack up my tent after a rainy day, whether it's still raining or not, I put my tent on the straps on the outside of the pack. That way the rain can drain from it and it can kind of go ahead and start airing out a little bit if it's not raining. If at some point on that second day the sun comes out, then I will lay my wet clothes out, I'll lay my tent out to dry, my sleeping bag in case it got a little damp from condensation, and I'll just go ahead and take a nice break in the sun and let everything dry back out. That way in camp that night, I'm not still dealing with moisture and a wet tent. Now let's talk about hail.
You got some hail on your breeches.
Hopefully you never have to deal with this while you're on trail, but it's a good thing to go ahead and think about and consider, what would I do if I was in a hailstorm? That way when it happens, you're not surprised and you have some sort of game plan. The first thing that you should do is get to shelter, whether that's a bush that you have to crawl up under or a group of trees or even a boulder. You just want to protect yourself from being pelted by hail. If you're in a very exposed area and there is nothing around to shelter you, then use your pack. Use your sleeping pad. If you have a closed cell phone pad, it seems like that would probably work pretty well. Just anything you can to protect your body, especially your head. Yes, it will hurt if your legs and arms are being pelted.
Oh, golly.
But being knocked unconscious by hail could lead to something much worse. Now let's talk about lightning. If you're gonna be out backpacking in mountainous, exposed areas, it's recommended that you get up to the exposed area and the peak of the mountain and down by noon, because in the early afternoon is when thunderstorms typically roll in. So you definitely want to scope out where you're going to be backpacking and find out what the typical weather patterns are for that area. In general, when dealing with lightning, the Weather Service suggests that if you can hear thunder, you can be struck by lightning. So the best thing that you can do is get to shelter or some sort of cover. You should avoid open fields, the top of hills, or ridges. Stay away from all tall, isolated objects, including trees. Beware of taking cover under rock shelters and cave entrances. They can be dangerous because lightning will travel along any surface to reach electrical ground. So if any part of your body is touching those surfaces, then the lightning can go through you. If you're in a group, you want to spread out to avoid the current traveling between group members. Stay away from water and wet items like a wet rope and metal objects like a fence. Lightning isn't attracted to these items, but they are good conductors of electricity. If you see signs like your hair standing up, or you feel your skin tingling, or you hear the buzzing of your trekking poles, or rocks, then a strike is imminent. At this point, the lightning crouch or lightning stance is recommended to reduce the amount of surface area that you have in contact with the ground. So you don't want to lie flat on the ground, but you want to crouch down and get up on the balls of your feet. If someone is struck, you want to give first aid and CPR if needed and you're trained. And then as soon as you can, call for help. And this is where I always recommend having a personal locator beacon, spot device, or in-reach device. All right, y'all, that's all I have for you today on backpacking in inclement weather. Of course, the best rule of thumb is to hope for the best, but to prepare for the worst. And I would say if you're just getting into backpacking, to try to go out when you're gonna have better weather. It just sets you up for a more successful trip. And while the worst days do tend to make the best stories, I think that when you're first getting acclimated to backpacking, you have enough to worry about that can go wrong. So trying to go in good weather is a good idea. And then once everything is more familiar to you, if you want to challenge yourself more by getting out in a little rainstorm, then go for it. For any of you more experienced folks, if you have any tips for dealing with inclement weather, including rain, wind, etc., and setting up and all of those, if you have any tips that you've found work for you, please share that in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoy the content of this channel, be sure to subscribe, and we will see y'all next time.